us, but we're going to get started. Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce two friends and well, colleagues, I would say. Many of you have had the privilege of learning with Professor Julia Lupton, who is known for her gifts in literature and Shakespeare, but a person of many talents. Julia also serves UCI on a broader scale and often helps write grant proposals and on creative projects that have nothing to do with English literature, I would say. And a few years ago, she reached out to me, knowing that I'm very committed to environmental stewardship and whatnot, to talk about a grant that the university was working on, called the Wildland-Urban
interface.
Whatever, she'll tell you what it is, but it's very.
We'll talk about it.
We'll talk about it, but really trying to talk about collaborative ways that communities can engage the most impacted populations on environmental solutions where they are. And it was very interesting to me. We shared some ideas, and I became part of the Faith Coalition as part of this science. It's really a science grant with a faith component. And Matt Hartman, Professor Hartman, was brought on to work on this project specifically. I'm going to let Julia introduce them. And I think we're in for some really interesting learning today. And I hope those of you who live in Orange County, not everybody does, will be able to join us Wednesday night at in South County, hosted at Temple Beth El, but the third of 4 what we're calling elemental climate conversations, just about the way various faith traditions connect to fire, water, earth, air, and also but engaging a scientific component as well. So Julia, I'll turn this over to you, and thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thank you, Marcia. I'm going to start my show and share my screen. And somebody was having sound trouble. Marcia, did you resolve it? Marcia Saltz?
Yes, I did. Thank you. I hadn't turned up my volume enough.
Great. I had the same issue when I got online this morning, so I sympathize.
Got it.
Okay, so I am a professor of English, but I also run a research institute, the UC Humanities Research Institute, and we do a lot of stuff that's not in my field. And one of them is this new work on climate action and climate communications that I've been involved with Marcia for the last year and a half, and also introducing my wonderful colleague, Dr. Matt Hartman, who will talk about some of his research. So the name of the network that we've organized at UC Irvine with a bunch of partners, who I'll talk about in a second, is called the Wildland-Urban Interface Climate Action Network. And let me just see if I can get my slides to advance. Whoops, sorry. Everything looks different on Zoom. There we go. So I'll talk a little bit about what WUICAN is, and I also want to talk about environmental justice, which is part of the WUICAN vision. And then I'll talk about the projects that Matt and I are involved in. So the WUICAN is the Wildland-Urban Interface Climate Action Network, and it's organized out of UC Irvine, where the principal investigator is located, a wonderful scientist named Stephen Allison. But we also have partners at Riverside in San Diego, and we work with local tribal groups, community groups, and land managers. And that's really what makes it unique, is this network partnership aspect, which has been very new for me and very exciting to learn more about. What is the WE, or the WUI? You may have seen this expression in the coverage of the fires in Los Angeles. WE is the Wildland-Urban Interface, and it's used in land management, fire management, and other areas of urban and extra urban planning. And a lot of our fires occur at this interface in the foothills, in the canyons, anywhere where there is wildland connecting with urban development. And we just have so much of that in Southern California, and that has made us very vulnerable to fire and drought, as we saw in the recent fires. The network consists of the 3 campuses, tribal groups, environmental justice organizations. I want to say a little bit more about that in a minute. We also work with land conservancies, Irvine Ranch Conservancy, Laguna Canyon Foundation, Crystal Cove Conservancy. And these are organizations that are stewarding land that is being conserved from development. And they do really important land conservation work, fire readiness work, and also a lot of education of youth and others about conservation and involving people really in hands-on projects for protecting the land. The faith-based part is where Marcia comes in and is one of the distinctive things that we put together as our part of this grant, where humanities branch of the grant. And so we're focusing on communications. And then also we have this great interfaith working group, and we've been doing programming, including our program on Wednesday at Temple Bethel on fire. So that's been very exciting as well. So what is environmental justice? And you may have seen the term in recent coverage of Executive Order 1451. And I'm just going to quote from that: terminating all DEI, DEIA, and environmental justice offices and positions, all equity action plans, equity actions, etc. And it's interesting that environmental justice is folded in here. The current administration is taking a very broad view of DEI, which stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, which tends to be focused on human resources, expanding the workforce, supporting a diverse workforce. And one of the things which the administration is doing is including anything under DEI that involves equity, trying to serve underserved communities, health equity, healthcare for women, for teens, that might have a gender basis to it, whether it's LGBTQ or not. It's a very, very blunt instrument, and environmental justice has come under attack along with these other programs. Our partners include environmental justice organizations. So this is the Orange County Environmental Justice Group, OCEJ, which is based in Santa Ana, and they work on air quality, heat mitigation, water quality, from a grassroots community point of view. And they have a definition of environmental justice on their website, which is from the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Right? Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And so really environmental justice is about asking communities, how is climate change and other environmental impacts affecting you? And how can you help shape the policy that will make those impacts, to help mitigate those impacts? Another organization we work with is Green MPNA, which is also based in Santa Ana. And they say that their goals are supporting youth and families to pursue educational and leadership opportunities, and 2, improving health equity outcomes through wellness programs and environmental justice policy work. And it's very concerning that health equity as well as environmental justice are under attack right now. Some community-based projects that these groups are doing in collaboration with UC Irvine include water quality, extreme heat mitigation, lead contamination in soil, and fire readiness. all very important things. This is a description of the goals and network model of this grant. And so you can see that outcome 1, create community-driven models for climate co-governance. So again, the idea that climate action needs to happen in the communities that are impacted. Building collaborative capacity. And so that's part of what Matt and I are doing with the communications, is working with organizations on their communications abilities and capacities. And then developing community-driven land stewardship practices and policies. And this especially involves trying to increase access by Native groups to conserved land. So we're putting tribal groups into contact with the conservancies in Orange County to improve access. So one project called the San Joaquin Marsh Audit, which is a partnership between the Sacred Places Institute of Indigenous People and UC Irvine. And here, really, the goal is to get the UC Natural Reserve System to be more open to tribal groups to help steward those lands, and to also be more open to tribal knowledge to help steward those lands. The University of California has huge holdings in the WUI, right, in the Wildland-Urban interface, out in the desert, near the coast, just all over. And so we're trying to start with our own lands and involve Native peoples more strategically in the stewardship of those lands. And that will be one of the topics at our fire event on Wednesday. So our fire event on Wednesday at Temple Beth El is going to really talk about tribal knowledge and stewardship. And some of the points there include increasing Indigenous access to conserved lands, also understanding Indigenous fire stewardship practices. Those practices are very ancient. They involve various forms of controlled burning, which Indigenous peoples refer to also as cultural burning. So there's a heritage and spiritual element involved. And those practices have been suppressed really since 1850 in California, and figuring out how to safely bring some of those practices back in ways that will improve fire readiness on the reservations and on conserved lands is one focus there. And then we're also going to have a botanist from UC San Diego who will talk about native plants and native plant recovery. And she comes from the Arapaho Nation and will bring both a Western science and a native science perspective to the question of how lands recover after drought and wildfire, because they often come back and they're more fire prone than they were before they caught on fire. And that has to do with the fact that invasive species come in and dominate in the regrowth of those territories. So we see all that beautiful mustard, for example, after rains, and that mustard isn't as lovely as it is not a native plant. And it's one of many of the invasive grasses that are replacing the natural shrubs that you may have grown up with in Orange County and in this region. So we're going to be learning about all those things on Wednesday. These are the interfaith events that we've held so far. We've done water and air, and now we're moving to fire. And we're going to look at earth in the spring at the Pacifica Institute in Lake Forest. And then in October, we're going to have a climate action festival at Harbor Christian Church that will bring together all of our faith partners, but also all of our land conservancies, our tribal groups, our environmental justice groups, to share their findings, get people involved in climate action, and have hands-on learning experiences about native plants and other issues of import. As the other thing that Matt and I are doing as part of this grant is that we are running a wonderful internship program. And we have 12 undergraduates. They're English majors, also anthropology and some history majors. And so we're really training them how to be climate communicators and also how to help build capacity in communications for the different grant partners that we're working with as part of WUICAN. And one of them, Sarah Tiersma, who will be at the event on Wednesday and has been working specifically on supporting the interfaith work that we're doing. She already has a job interview up north at a land conservancy to work on communications for that organization. So we're really happy that we've been able to involve humanities majors who are not, some of them have some science background, but they're really coming in as communicators and storytellers and videographers and people who can create web content and social media campaigns and really put that humanities, English, Shakespeare, so I know I've got a lot of my Shakespeare people here today, put that training into action to be able to communicate with people about how they can help and what's happening, and trying to explain things like what is environmental justice, what is health equity, right? Because we need to hold on to valuable concepts and not let them become criminalized concepts. So I think that is what I wanted to present in a general way about the work that we're doing. And I don't know, Marcia, before I introduce Matt, did you want to add anything about the interfaith work that we're doing and how you've been able to amplify that?
Well, I mean, I guess what I, what I think is very, I mean, we talk about religious values and ethical values as, I mean, in each of our traditions, we would like to imagine that respect for the earth and the land is embedded in every faith tradition. And one of the things that I've learned in our work together is that that's not always obvious or has risen to the top. And I do think that what we've been trying to do is identify the leaders in our faith communities who are committed to doing this, even if the organized part of their religious communities really isn't focused on it yet, and try to bring that to light. I mean, it starts with one person. You know, Rabbi Ellen Bernstein was the first person in the organized Jewish world. She died this past year, who actually, you know, spoke out about and dedicated her rabbinate to environmental protections. And that was the beginning of a lot of us, you know, opening up our consciousness to that. So I just think that the power of one person is really important. And one of the things I'm excited about this faith work that we're doing is that we're including the Sikh community and the Muslim community, and, you know, the work that Sadie and Ryan are doing. So I think that it all you just need one passionate person to get the ball rolling with some good uh, um, uh, caring people behind you. Anyway, so it's very exciting. Does anybody have any questions specifically about WUICAN before before we introduce Matt? Okay, well, let's
All right, so I'm really happy to introduce Matt Hartman. He's our postdoc on the WUICAN grant, and we had a very competitive pool. And Matt was my first choice because he really comes from a religious studies and environmental religious studies background. And I knew that I wanted interfaith work to be at the center of what my part of the grant would be contributing, because it's a passion of mine, as Marcia knows. And so Matt did his graduate work at the Graduate Theological Seminary in Berkeley, California. And his focus was on climate and religion. And his dissertation, it was on climate denialism and the religious right. And that is unfortunately not a fringe thing. We're seeing it now becoming the dominant discourse in this country after having been somewhat kept at bay. And I have not read Matt's dissertation, and I have wanted to learn more about his research and also his personal journey. And so Matt is going to talk about climate denialism and what some of its features are. So Matt.
Great. Well, thanks so much for that introduction, Julia. And make sure that that this all works here. Let's see. Are you just seeing my slides? Or are you seeing my whole screen here?
We're seeing a little bit of a taskbar, but we're also seeing your slides.
Okay.
And it's okay if we see your taskbar, that's fine.
Okay. As long as you're not seeing all of my notes scribbled around everywhere, then I think we're fine. Yeah, so I think when I was doing my research, I really kind of got started toward the end of the first Trump administration, beginning of the Biden administration, really when I was kind of like doing a lot of my writing. A lot of the folks that I had been following for just what all was happening in this space of climate denialism were kind of feeling like they had won, or had climate denialism seemed to be receding in some ways. I think my questions have always been, where did this come from? Where how did it start, and where does it go from here? And so I feel like there were always a skepticism of celebrations that climate denialism might kind of peter out, because, and as we've seen, there has been a resurgence in this kind of focus on climate skepticism, dismantling of environmental protection organizations. So in some ways, this is I've been doing different work in my postdoctoral studies here at the UC Humanities Research Institute, but this work that I've done on climate denialism, this kind of mix of religion and politics, and a certain kind of nationalist view of America, has really had a resurgence. Maybe I'll just say a quick word about myself. So my title is I work in climate communications and environmental justice at UCHRI, but I did do my PhD at the Graduate Theological Union, as Julian mentioned, and so I was in a lot of conversations around religion and the environment, and a lot. And the GTU is in Berkeley, so it's right next to UC Berkeley's campus, but it's also made up of a consortium of many different religious traditions, and so there's a lot of really rich conversation around these topics, and hearing a lot of different perspectives on where people are coming from. And again, a lot of my, just to emphasize my kind of my guiding questions for some of this research, partly came from my own experience growing up in the Midwest. I grew up in rural Missouri, and most people who I knew in my community were evangelical Christians who either were not interested in the realities of climate change, or did not believe that climate change existed. So this was always something that was kind of in the back of my mind. And when I started asking some of these research questions to do my doctoral studies, I was really interested in why that was the case. I did grow up around a lot of people who felt very connected to the land in some way around them, connected to the natural environment, but were also skeptical of this larger kind of issue of climate change that seemed to be very quickly politicized. Another big question, which I'll touch on here briefly, but won't linger on too much, is it's kind of, where does climate change denialism go from here? And I have some thoughts on that, which we can talk maybe more about in the Q&A. But I also do kind of want to focus on what can we do about it, which I think is an important question. So to start off, and everyone can see the change slides there, right? Okay, I just want to make sure I'm kind of doing a few different things here. So I wanted to start here with this if anyone thought that climate denialism was diminishing at all, this is a very recent example. So I probably due to some of the different organizations I kind of keep tabs on for my own research, I get sponsored content a lot from various very conservative groups. And this one is, I don't know if anyone is familiar with PragerU, but I just took these screenshots from from an Instagram ad that I kept receiving. So the LA wildfires obviously are still very, very much on everyone's minds, and communities are still reeling. And this was happening. These kinds of paid ads were happening in the midst of this. And if anyone doesn't know what PragerU is, PragerU stands for Prager University, which says that it is they call themselves a nonprofit that promote American values through short educational videos for people of all ages. If you actually go to these videos that are behind these ads, they focus a lot on, apparently there was a report not long ago that said that air turbulence is going to get worse due to climate change, and that was something that they focus on. So they don't even focus much on the wildfires themselves, but they use this as a kind of shock value thing, and they often pick up on things that might seem less of a concern to most folks, like the air turbulence and such. But these were things that they were posting. They also post during other tragedies. They were posting during the North Carolina flooding. So I think this is kind of a go-to to sort of flood the zone, a term that we might have heard recently, of creating a sort of general sense of skepticism. Why is everything blamed on climate change? Is kind of their focus. So, and I should just briefly mention before I move on, this is not just kind of a one-off group. If you haven't heard of PragerU, they are now, a lot of their short educational videos, they focus a lot on children, and they are now in the state educational curriculum of Florida, Oklahoma, and Montana. So they are, they're not just kind of producing content for their own audiences. They are in other spaces. But
Man,
these
I just want to
yes, yeah.
share. PragerU is, is Jewishly sponsored and Jewishly. I mean, Dennis Prager used to be a well-known Jewish inspirational teacher, and in fact, he started the Brandeis Collegiate Institute with Joseph Telushkin many years ago in the 80s and 90s, and he's really gone off the deep end and is deeply enmeshed with some also very slanted evangelical groups. But this is just know that this is no religion is impervious to this, and it's hard for me to know that he is so involved with this, but I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, it's a great point, and really kind of demonstrates the ways that these coalitions form, which is going to get to a point that I'm going to make here in a minute, that it's not just any one religion, that I think there are these kinds of ways that relationships and coalitions form, and and a lot of my research did focus on evangelicals, who were and are still hold a lot of power in American politics, but and when a lot of this discourse was being shaped in the 70s and 80s, it was a lot of evangelical groups like the Moral Majority, Gerald Falwell, Pat Robertson, and some of these folks that were shaping the Reagan administration and forward. But there are these other kind of crossings through different religions, different folks. So yeah, I think it's a really good point. So maybe these kinds of materials are more reminiscent of kind of what we think of with kind of classic climate change denial, or what you may think of when you hear that term. So here's just a couple of examples of this. I think in a more broader scale, you have a number of comments that Donald Trump has made before he was president, during his first term. The kind of classic language around it being a hoax, but also just kind of making fun of it in some way, making fun of environmentalists, this way of kind of like creating a sense of silliness around the issue, right? That allows people to either not take it as seriously or be skeptical. The other one is this kind of gift that I found of James Inhofe. I don't know if people are familiar with this, but it became a kind of symbol of climate denialism, where James Inhofe was a senator in Oklahoma, and I think it was in 2014, which then was the hottest year on record, and he came up to give a speech to make light of this alarmism over it being the hottest year on record, and had a snowball that he brought in that he said was just from just outside, and his point being that it's really cold outside. How can global warming be happening? And then he tosses the snowball to one of the interns. So it's just kind of like very very spectacular symbol of that's meant to show that climate change isn't actually happening. But I do want to just mention really quickly, kind of, so, these folks have been, have been engaged in this kind of denialism for a while, right? And this is and I'll talk briefly a little bit more about the history of that, but I also just want to say a bit about where I see this heading, which was a little bit of my research. And a couple of notes about, I think one of the biggest issues that we're going to face more, climate change is always talked about as this kind of existential crisis, but I think one of the things that will happen much more soon is an influx of climate migrants, which we're already seeing. And I think a way that denial really kind of manifests is you have a lot of folks who are making, the southern border of the United States, or this kind of influx of migration, an issue without naming climate change as the kind of undergirding issue. And there are a lot of there are a lot of political persecution narratives. There are a lot of crises happening in multiple countries that create these circumstances, but they're all kind of influenced by climate change, where drought happens, where crop failure happens, and then it creates these conditions that exacerbates political turmoil, that exacerbates the need for people to leave, that create displacement through spectacular weather events. So this is an issue that continues to grow and will continue to be a crisis. And rather than sort of addressing some of the root causes, there's this kind of, I think, denialism that continues to take place. The other flip side of that, which I won't get into a lot here, but I think is something that does really worry me, which is I found a lot of instances of politicians and sort of using immigration as using immigrants as scapegoats for other concerns, and these kinds of so there are a couple of politicians in Arizona who have long been climate change deniers, but started using the language of environmental protection to keep out immigrants. And so I refer to this as climate nationalism in some of my work, where there's this kind of almost on a dime, this turn from we don't believe climate change is happening to, well, if it is happening, who are we going to blame? Or at least who are we going to blame for whatever is happening, even if we don't call it climate change? And I think this kind of where violence is going to be enacted is, I think, a big risk. And I know, Marcia, you've done a lot of work. I know we've had some conversations recently around migration crises and how to support people. And I think this is one of the ways that if folks want to get involved to in an issue that is directly related to the climate crisis, and is directly impacting people now, it is migrants who have nowhere else to turn, right? And so it's something we can return to at the end too. But I just wanted to briefly mention that. Also, just to say, so that's kind of where I see the future of climate denial moving, which is either this kind of doubling down or a quick turn to scapegoat less fortunate folks who might be displaced. I think there are a couple of narratives of kind of the origins of climate denial, which I've gone into more in some of my work, but just briefly, I think there's the awareness of climate change is not as recent as um, a lot of big oil and other groups might want us to think, but as early as the 1970s, folks were talking about climate change as something that was very real, and these were people at so there was a report by this Inside Climate News, which is a great source, but Exxon, the road not taken, they did this big study of Exxon. They found that um, uh, that the company's knowledge of climate change dated back to 1977, when there was a senior scientist, James Black, who said, I'll just quote him real quick here, in the first place, there is a general scientific agreement that the most likely manner in which mankind is influencing the global climate is through carbon dioxide release from the burning of fossil fuels. And then went on to give this window of 5 to 10 years of needing to do something. So there is this kind of evidence that that folks have known about this for a while, but then for kind of rather than doing something about it, sort of went into a position of wanting to keep the status quo and continue to maximize profits in the oil and gas industry. But the kind of influence of big business, big oil, that has pumped a lot of money into sponsoring campaigns of denialism and skepticism. That is one of the narratives, which I think is one of the more insidious ones. Everything from BP used to have this. They may still have this. You can go on and put in your what you do on a daily basis and calculate your carbon footprint, and then figure out how much you need to do as an individual to offset your own carbon emissions. And this is coming from a massive oil company. So it's this way of creating a sort of skepticism, or if they are wanting you, if you do feel bad about climate change, it's a way to kind of put the blame back on the individual, right, rather than the corporation. So there's kind of ways that corporations and big oil exist to maximize their own profits at the expense of others. And then one other narrative I just want to mention real quick is, in a lot of my studies in evangelicalism, I think there's this belief that that a lot of evangelicals don't believe in climate change for theological reasons, an interpretation of the creation story in Genesis, which there's language that talks about stewardship, and then there's language that talks about dominion. And the idea had been for a long time that that it was a kind of theological belief that the dominion narrative kind of had won out for a lot of evangelicals. What's really interesting is I have this other book up here, The Gospel of Climate Skepticism. Oh, I should mention Merchants of Doubt is kind of a foundational text on a lot of different big businesses that sow doubt from tobacco smoke to global warming, and kind of find some through lines within them, and then how to maybe combat some of those narratives. The Gospel of Climate Skepticism is a little more academic-y, but does kind of talk about this, really address this idea of theology, if that is kind of the root of climate skepticism in the U.S., and actually finds that it's more based around identity than anything else. So there's not a kind of history of climate skepticism within evangelicalism until a little bit later, after the 60s and 70s. And there's Robin Belman finds a number of examples of Christian leaders making climate skepticism a biblical issue versus the other way around, versus a sort of like a tradition of biblical teaching. And maybe, well, so I think this focus on identity and what all that comes with. It's, identity is social. It's about feeling a sense of belonging to community. And I think the shaping of identity is kind of an evolving process. It's you're beholden to your community, you're beholden to people that you care about. And I think this is really important because I think that these convictions are not always hard and fast. And this is kind of where I see an area of potential way to open up conversation and to potentially change hearts and minds, if you will. I think adding on to this idea that climate denialism has not always been the kind of core evangelical issue is, in the 60s and 70s, you had a big movement to protect the environment. And that was, people, I think, forget a lot of times that Richard Nixon was the one who signed the Environmental Protection Agency into existence, the Council on Environmental Quality. Others he did was the National Environmental Policy Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act. There were all these, this kind of slew of legislation that a lot of times were led by religious groups, and particularly evangelicals, but a coalition of religious groups that were concerned for creation, concerned for valuing notions of stewardship. And so this isn't a kind of, I think I talked to a lot of people who are kind of nihilistic, I suppose, that some of these groups that have been spreading climate denialism for so long are will change, but they have changed, right? I think that this is like part of the like what I'm interested in, how that conversation happens. And then just briefly in closing, because I know I'm kind of coming on time here, I want to leave some Q&A. Where does this leave us, I guess? So if anyone hasn't heard of this book, I always recommend this, The Great Derangement by Amit Ghosh. He's a fiction writer. And Amit Ghosh is kind of, he writes this book reacting against this notion, I think for a long time, that the more science that we have, the more information that kind of gets pumped into us, we learn more about climate science, that climate denial will effectively go away, which just hasn't been the case. And so for Ghosh, he talks about the climate crisis is not merely a crisis of science or policy or history, but of knowledge and of culture and of narrative. And so I think how we communicate, how we talk about climate change, and how the stories that we tell are crucial to making change. He actually ends his book really interestingly by comparing the Paris Climate Accord with Laudato Si by Pope Francis. So he does this brings in this kind of religious text to say that, while the Paris Climate Accord was such an important policy piece that was worked on for so long, many people, of course, America's not in it anymore, as we kind of ping in and out of it at this time. But even still had a lot of limitations in a way that when he compared that to Laudato Si, which is Pope Francis's treatise on ecological values, there were in that document, there was language of social justice, there was language of climate migrants, of marginalized peoples, and had a much more kind of effervescent way of speaking about this that I think could, for his perspective, could galvanize people in a way that maybe a policy document may not. And so it's kind of this hand in hand thing, right? It's like we need the policies that are really important. And I think one way to make change on an individual level is to call representatives, to get involved in local groups. And that's kind of where I want to end, which is just what Julie was talking about. I think this kind of way of building solidarity, of building community around shared values, even with different groups like an interfaith coalition, I think is a way of opening up conversation that is really important, and I think can following some of this interfaith work that Amit Ghosh talks about and others, but I think a way to galvanize communities that care about an issue, but that is going to require building bridges, and I think a lot about unions. I think a lot about tenant workers associations that are advocating for a very specific right for people, regardless of political affiliations. And so I think these are the kinds of questions I'm interested in: is what does building coalitions look like, where, the climate crisis is going to impact everyone. Ultra right people, nationalist people, people of lots of different uh, positions and lots of different places that they're coming from. How do we kind of work within this framework to create something that is meaningful and action oriented? And so I think that's kind of the circle around back to the what we're doing with WUICAN and the interfaith work. I think is creating conversations in localized spaces that might involve more people and create change at kind of a local level. So I'll go ahead and stop there, and then we can we can always jump into any of these issues more. But thanks for letting me share.
That was great, Matt. Thank you.
Wonderful. And I'm mindful of the fact that, again, I think for me this is the only issue of our time. I mean, there are so many issues of our time, but it all ties in, to equity and human dignity and land dignity and all of that. And I cannot help but notice how few people are here this morning. When somebody's talking about history or something else, we can have as many as 27, 28 people. But I wonder, this really does not tend to be a topic that is of priority for people to confront, learn about, study. And I just want to, bring that to the surface. And to me, that's one of the elephants in every room. Who's willing to show up and learn and be engaged.
And it didn't seem to move the needle in the election.
Right. I mean,
Yeah, and it's like
neither did
very few people as it a priority. And so
rights.
other issues drove the election, and this is going to be set us back years. I mean, it's very upsetting.
I even think that's a generous way. I don't think it's a setback. I mean, I really think it's expediting human demise. I mean, world and human demise. I mean, you can't even begin to put like in a couple years, like, I don't think so. So it was anyway. I wanted to. I know some people are not actually on screen. I don't know if you're with us or not, but I hope so. But Ria has raised her hand. Go ahead,
Hi,
Ria.
Ria.
Hi, yeah. Susan knows why I'm not on visually. But anyway, that there many, many years ago, there was a film about the destruction of vegetation, and it started far away from where the movie was focused. It was an English-speaking country. It may have been England, it may have been the United States, in a very nice country club setting with a beautiful dinner and people sitting around about this terrible scourge that's hitting the other part of the world, and it's destroying vegetation, and there's starvation beginning, and they just go into this intellectual conversation. And then as the film proceeds, it comes to this, either the United States or England, and it has covered the earth. And I think that's the sense I get about it's too horrible to think about. And if we put it in another pocket that is not ours, then we can intellectualize about it. We can say that it's bunk. We can do all of these things. And I'm afraid that this is what is going to be the end result. But of course, I'm not going to go there because we all want to try. And because there's this general sense of anti-intellectualism, which is not new in this country. It's existed, in various times. It peeks out of its head into to the world. So I'm flummoxed. I do not know how people can look with their eyes and they can feel what's happening, but just put it out of their minds. It's someplace else. And isn't that too bad for those people? Isn't this pessimistic? Oh,
I hear you, Ria. I hear you.
all I can say is, oi, we try. We were going to try. And the book Dune, the first one, and it takes place, it's a science fiction, and it takes place on a planet where there's a special spice that the world has become addicted to. And so they're out there mining the special spice, and they have to wear special suits to maintain their to be alive. It's not only the oxygen, but it's a still suit, it's called, and it recirculates the moisture of the body. So because the environment is so horrible. So this is the picture that is our Earth. If in its the projection, the worst projection is it's Dune, and we're wearing still suits. Okay, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Ria. I appreciate everything that you said, and I know, it's it must be hard. I mean, for you, you are a senior, and a robust and vibrant senior. You've seen a lot in your lifetime, and I can't imagine this doesn't weigh on you a little bit. I mean, in a way, you're like, really, what have we done? Sylvia.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. And I was thinking when you were talking, Matt, about Julia, I can't remember, but why it is so hard for people to pay attention to change in the climate and what's really in front of our eyes. You have to be blind not to see it. A few years ago, B'nai Jeshurun and Rabbi Role did a whole seminar on Shemitah and the environment. It was excellent. It was really excellent. And I took it back to my little group for like a 5-minute talk. Here's what it got. Too little, too late. There's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can do. And this is the overwhelming attitude that I hear and see. And I certainly need to be in places like this because I can get taken down by that very easily. I can go to that negative spot very easily. My personality, so it's a very, very hard issue. And when you're talking about the overwhelming facts of what is going on in the world today, politically, and the retreat of democracy, it may seem like a side issue, rather than, because I mean the big issue is fighting for freedom, fighting against the powers that are bringing in more autocratic systems. This is it's a big issue, and it's hard. It's wonderful for me to come here and to listen and to learn and to see what it is I can do or who I can talk to or whatever. I mean, I'm not out in the streets, gotta say, too old for that. I'm not doing that anymore. But but there are things that I can address, and these are some of them. And thank you very much for this talk.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I think making those connections is really important because those are all of that is related. The kind of proceeding of democracy, um, the increased climate catastrophe, right? Like these are all related. I think being clear-eyed about that and making those connections that aren't always clearly made in various places, I think is important. Yeah, and I think your note about, well, in a lot of different climate activist circles, people talk about the importance of coming together to just as a kind of release to be like you're talking about coming into spaces like this where you can feel a sense of energizing because it can be very dismaying. And I think that that's a really important part of engaging this material is taking care of each other and ourselves. There, I think the kind of doomerism is the term, that kind of too little too late response and feeling like it's like there's nothing to be done, but it can really take over in some ways. And so I think being able to find those places that are rejuvenating, that allow, I'm big on hope related to the climate crisis, and I don't mean that in a kind of naive sense that like someone else will come in and fix this, but I think hope, which I is obviously a very crucial term in all different religious traditions, right? But it's a way of engaging one another and acting, and I think that is it's hope with action. I think is really critical, and then I think to your point of just like finding ways to get involved where you can, whatever that looks like. People have. I've just listened to somebody on a podcast who was talking about how a lot of these, especially youth-led climate activist groups, like don't have a lot of professional training where someone who might have legal skills or someone who might have other whatever skills you might bring to something. A lot of these movements can use that, and that doesn't mean necessarily being out at all the marches, but support in whether it's professional skills, financial support, etc. is a really important part of building coalitions and solidarity and supporting all of supporting everybody together.
Well, that's a hopeful note, Matt. Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording now for a second.